Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, Hybrid IT and Government, sponsored by QTS on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today are Sanjay Gupta, the Chief Technology Officer at the Small Business Administration, Ben Bergensen, the Chief Information Officer at the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, and Tim Burke, a Federal Cloud Product Manager for QTS. Now, before break, we were talking a little bit about what the cloud looks like at each of your agencies. And I want to start with Sanjay, because you brought up something that just is one of my favorite topics, the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation, CDM program. You talked about you're one of the first, if not the first agency to do CDM in the cloud. Talk about how this relates back to your cloud efforts, because CDM is such an important initiative for all of the government.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think thanks for that question, Jason. So CDM is definitely a very important component and much needed component, especially in the cloud. Let me kind of just sort of back up for a minute and just talk about why the cloud environment, well, it gives us agility and flexibility. That's the power of the cloud, amongst others. But also what comes with that is the responsibility of the fast changing environment in the cloud environment, which is compared to the on-prem environment, is a paradigm change. So let me just give you 4 instances, and then hopefully that'll illustrate the point here. So if you are in an on-premise environment and you're talking about change control, you probably have change control boards, and they do like meet twice a week or three times a week, and they make those changes and they approve those changes. But when you're in a cloud environment, you're making changes several times a day. And this whole process and the notion of having a change control board that meets and approves those changes and reviews those changes just sort of is a different paradigm here. So let me kind of hit upon the security aspects and the CDM aspects. So what I'm trying to make a point here is the fact that in the cloud, you have the ability to move fast, and you have to be able to leverage that. Otherwise, you're sort of missing one of the key components of the cloud. At the same time, you have to ensure you have a good, secure environment and continues to be secure with all the changes that you are imparting in the cloud environment. So from our perspective at SBA, when we talked about the CDM implementation, what we did is we looked at what the DHS requirement for CDM Phase 1 are. And we looked at the fact that they are more specifically inclined on the outcomes that those CDM tools produce. And we said it should not really matter if we implement those tools in the cloud or on-prem, and the fact that we have a cloud-first strategy and we are trying to stay true to our cloud-first strategy, we implemented the tools in the cloud instance we have. So yes, there's a slight difference the way you would implement it on-premise, but from a standpoint of the outcomes and the results it's producing, it's pretty much similar to what it would have done in an on-prem environment. Further, when we talk about implementing in the cloud, we have the ability to use other cloud-native tools in addition to the CDM tools in conjunction to produce a more comprehensive view of what is going on at a given point in time. We are looking at tools which give us a real-time view into our dashboard on the cloud, in terms of security, in terms of vulnerabilities, in terms of risks. That's something which is very valuable to us, and naturally that's where I was talking about the continuous aspect of being in the cloud.
It's interesting that you said as we move to cloud first, okay, how do we take what DHS is asking us to do and do it there?
Right.
What was the reaction? Was DHS open to that, or was there a little bit of convincing?
I think there was a little bit of convincing. Certainly our Deputy Guy Cavallo and Maria Road, our CIO, have seen that space. Maria was part of the FedRAMP program.
Right.
She understands that inside out. And Guy Cavallo was at the TSA. He's worked on those angles pretty in detail. So they were able to have that dialogue and have that discussion to say, we are driven from outcomes, and if we can produce the same outcome regardless of where the CDM tools are implemented, we should be able to comply with the CDM requirement. So that's how we were able to overcome it. But it did require some discussion and convincing.
One of the things, whether we're talking CDM here or whether we're just talking security more broadly, one of the things that Sanjay brought up was this idea of this comprehensive view, understanding your risks, your vulnerabilities, the current posture of security. Tim, is that maybe the one kind of understated value of cloud in some ways, is that, hey, it's not just you can be agile and flexible and all those great things, but you really have a different view than you would on-prem in some regards.
Certainly, I also think one of the things that's often overlooked is you just get there and you get your ATO, but you've really just started.
Yes.
Right? You really started the hard work of getting it. It's real. But keeping it running in a secure and compliant fashion is really where a lot of the hard and sometimes not glorious work is there. All right, so one of the things that we talk about and what we see clients asking us for is the level of maturity, right, and how you're performing. And do you really have an organization from a compliance and security perspective that can help operate my application, my system that helps me meet that mission goal? So, you know, a while ago, I would say a few years ago, as folks were talking about FedRAMP and what have you and meeting FSMA requirements, you know, there was this phase of confusion, really. What is this thing? I don't even know, but I know I need it. An example would be federal system integrators that said, I want a deal, but I'm not sure what I need to do. Right? And then we moved into a phase into comprehension. People understand this is a requirement. I need to do this. You guys understand I need to do it, but there's other folks maybe in the world that haven't gotten to that point. And then there's the level of compliance to really get your authority to operate, and then also to keep moving. So the things I would suggest that folks ask their provider. Right? Simple things like you mentioned before. You need to have a process, documentation, a procedure, and an audit trail. It's almost as simple as that for things that you manage. And you need to make sure that your provider has all of those things. And you just ask simple questions. Do you have a continuous monitoring program, right? How do you operate? Tell me about it. Tell me about your change management. Tell me about your continuity and disaster recovery plan for my application. If a provider can't tell you about that, and it ends up, like I mentioned before, being the person or a small team, then maybe something that you take a pause on, right? In the way we've designed things, we have a large team, of course, that provides those things. The other is meeting something called separation of duties, right? This is another thing to check to make sure you've built a fully robust team to support the agency mission. You know, things like having a separate chief audit executive, chief information system officer, and a CTO, and have a proper functionality between detection, remediation, and validation. So this whole workflow and this whole team that can be there to support, folks really need to, when you're talking about going to a CSP, that you're fully validating those things. It's one thing to say you can do it or just trust me. It's another thing that you should also be able to prove that you do those things. And things are way more prescriptive now, right, with FedRAMP. I mean, years ago it was get your ATO, maybe I'll come back 3 years later. Well, what happened in between? The risk was still there. Was the mitigation there, or was there a breach or a leak beforehand? So now we collectively have much more prescriptive requirements for performing continuous monitoring, reporting our results, whether it be to the agency or to a program management office, and on an annual basis. So the world has changed, the structure has changed, and you got to have the right kind of organization to support the mission goal.
Ben, I want to turn to you about the auditing trail, but before that, Tim, just real quick, the continuous monitoring piece. Is that something that every cloud provider, and I know you can't speak for every one of them, but is doing, or is it still, they're not quite there yet in terms of the understanding of that the government expects this continuous monitoring, or worse, it's just labeled continuous monitoring, but maybe it's really not continuous, you know, generally speaking. I mean, give me a sense of what the industry looks like.
Yeah, I don't think I'll do it. I think a lot say trust. So you can look at FedRAMP per se and say in the marketplace, how many have been authorized? Well, there's 86 that have been authorized in continuous monitoring. They're vetted every month. Every month we meet with the PMO on a biweekly basis and report, you know, our remediation list and whether we're on time or not. And other, if you don't do those things, you can have your authorization revoked, and it has happened. Not with us, but it has happened to other providers.
You know, that's news. I didn't hear about that. But one of the other things is, as you said, the monthly. I know FedRAMP has talked about even turn that up to real time, or as near real time as possible for that monitoring. So maybe something that to look up for. Ben, I want to turn to you real quick because as you guys are moving to the cloud and you have that hybrid environment, how are you addressing the expectations, as Tim talked about, the continuous monitoring expectations, but also are your providers doing what they say they're doing?
I'm drawing on my experience when I was the information security officer for max.gov, shared services and cloud. And it was a cloud provider. It was also a cloud partner because we would have other cloud organizations, commercial and federal, provide services jointly with us. And you would find out that things were done differently in different organizations and different cloud providers. So what I'm drawing on at USTA is we would be looking for outcomes. Not prescribing, okay, we're going to use this particular technology, this particular audit tool, and this particular dashboard, but what we're looking for is an information system security, continuous monitoring, ISCM and CDM, and here's what we want. We want a dashboard at the agency level, we want it at DHS level, we want it across our local environment as well as our shared services, as well as our commercial providers, and it helps a lot because when I was sitting on the Tiger team for the FedRAMP High baseline, and we were developing the new standard for FedRAMP High, it was, well, that doesn't work because I know the tools we have, and that requirement is too specific. Let's look at what the outcome is. And that's what agencies should be looking at is, I want to understand the risks and the environment that I am at and be able to make decisions and then work with my provider to move the bar on those risks. But the exact details can be left up to the providers.
And for the most part, do providers understand that? Because there is a shift that's been happening, and we see that with, we can talk about iterative development or agile or DevOps, or whatever you want to call it, that well, just tell me what you want, I'll build what you want. And no, we want this outcome. No, just, but what do you want? Like, do you have that conversation still? Or as Tim was saying, a lot of people or there's this kind of move that people are getting it.
There's a change in understanding that it's a partnership of continuous risk assessment in everything that you do, and say, okay, there's a new version of the platform for your website or your web portal coming out. How does that change things? And that's a conversation that you have with your customer, as opposed to once every year, or once every 3 years, or it's done at the cloud provider level. It's more of a conversation of, okay, let's sit down and tell me what the impacts are. And I'm willing to accept this level of risk for this period of time. So it's more temporal. Say, okay, and that's where you get into DevOps and security into DevOps. Say, okay, we're going to move, so we're thinking of moving our website from one environment to another environment. And said, okay, what's the period of time of risk that we're going to be down with our website? And I said, well, the technology will take this many hours to transition. I said, and what happens if it doesn't work? They said, well, we turn the VM off there and we turn it back on here and it's instantly back. I said, so if we're going too far in time and I've hit my threshold of risk, we can just revert like that. And those conversations are very liberating for the agencies.
Ben brought up the R word, risk. Let's talk a little bit about that, because that's a huge piece of the cybersecurity discussion and something that the Office of Management and Budget, the White House, is really putting a lot of focus on. Let me start with Tim real quick. From a risk perspective, how are you hearing agencies talk about risk, and how do you respond?
So a couple of different ways. So we hear in some of the other topics we had mentioned before coming into the meeting were, service level agreements and how you manage those service level agreements, and how you partner and making sure you're meeting requirements. So we do see requests for help take on and help manage part of my risk, and it comes in many ways, just simple performance. And part of how we make sure we meet those, and we talk about some of Ben's previous comments, right? We match those requirements to a solution. We put together components, right? So Ben and team probably had different components for that failover solution versus the ongoing production application. So one is for us is managing those components in a compliant fashion, is making sure we got the technology pieces together and operating them in a compliant fashion that helps minimize the risk of downtime, whether it be making sure that we follow our change advisory board and continuous monitoring and change management process to make sure we detect things. It can be as a programmatic vulnerability that folks know about, or how quickly you react to a 0 day. All right, what did you do with any of the recent ransomware, Petya and WannaCry, and even back a couple of years ago with Heartbleed and Bash? I mean, you need, and all these things impact the availability. So if I get an outcome request SLA, right, we're piecing these things together in a formulatic fashion to meet the goal and minimize the risk, which helps us together minimize that risk for availability. And there have been requests for, hey, how much of a financial share can you make? Can you take on of that? Right? You talk about healthcare, right? Yeah, right. And there are requirements that we sign and take on some of that responsibility. And those are a discussion. There is no straight answer. It is you talk with both legal teams, and you talk about what particular the requirements are and which the organizations are willing to take on. So a covered entity with a trusted provider, we make sure we work together on that.
Now, Sanjay, Tim brought up the service level agreements item. That's been one of the toughest pieces of moving to the cloud for agencies, and now as this hybrid IT environment emerges, that becomes even more complex. How are you guys addressing this SLA issue?
Right, and I think I'd just like to also make a quick point about what we are doing from a CDM implementation and other aspects is the fact that we're using the DISA STIGs for all of our Windows Server, SQL Server, baselines, and that a relatively high bar, if you will, in terms of the baseline configurations, right? Which helps us manage risk probably on a little higher end, if you will, compared to what was being done previously. In terms of the service levels, yes, it's a very different paradigm in the cloud. And like I was talking about earlier, one of the things about, we talked about DevOps, I know Ben mentioned that, and you mentioned about the DevSecOps as well. I think one of the things that we are seeing that's really integral to our success in the cloud is the fact that we have to change the way traditionally we had worked. For example, the NOC, the Network Operations Center, or the Security Operations Center, they were two different teams. They're no longer two different teams in the cloud. They have to be the same integral team, which manages both the network side of it as well as the security aspects of it. And that's, if you would think about, is a change in terms of the people, the way they've done work, the processes, as well as the tool set we're looking at, right? In terms of service levels, I'll just give you another illustration of the fact that how service level change in the cloud world. For example, you know, in the on-prem world, if a server had problem, had some issues, you took some time to repair it. In the cloud world, there's really no need to do the repair. What you do is spin up a new server, and off you're up and running, and you have your data imports in a matter of minutes. So the paradigm has totally changed in the cloud when you're talking about service levels here. There's no longer a service level of mean time to repair. Probably the mean time to repair in this case will be how fast can you spin up the next VM. And now it's measured in minutes, not in hours, not in days, not in weeks, certainly not any other thing beyond that. So that's a paradigm change, and people are having a little tough time sort of adopting that mind shift change.
And I think part of that is because they're so used to, is what you said, you will give me 99.9999, and if something breaks, you'll fix it quickly.
Exactly.
And so, great point. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we can jump into some more discussion. You're listening to the panel discussion, Hybrid IT and Government, sponsored by QTS on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.